Hello you handsome commanders, this is ArcSam, and today I'm going to be highlighting a game against an exceptionally aggressive opponent who has planned out to play what is and was a meta strategy. In particular, we're going to be seeing some steel balls, some mustangs, and a lot of extra speed. I picked up a giant specialist with the idea of perhaps going into more overlords, see how they feel after the patch, or maybe some Vulcans, or perhaps a fortress, but that's not gonna be happening this game, as my opponent is going to be putting the maximum amount of pressure possible. So, understanding what my opponent's plan already is from turn 1, I try to organize my formation so that my opponent's units become, if not harmless, very close to being harmless. If it wasn't clear, the Arclights are here to support the Stormcrawlers both as a tank and as a direct counter to crawlers, while the Stormcrawlers are actually going to be doing most of the damage, both single target and area of effect, when the units actually stop moving. And as it turns out, when you're dealing with a bunch of crawlers and as well as a various amount of steel balls, crawlers of your own are actually really good at stopping that in the early game, while also providing the opportunity to perhaps flank your opponent. Now my opponent has already established crawlers on the back of their towers, meaning that it's going to be a little bit harder to flank them later into the game, but that's not entirely impossible. And turn 1, we do in fact clean up shop particularly well, losing a bare minimum of our units, with the Stormcrawlers providing the support and single target damage necessary to clean up this mess. That being said, I'm trying to look at what my options are here. One of the options is to go mass produce rhinos with last blitz, as that was in fact buffed, and it is entirely cheaper to invest into, especially for scenarios like this. But I went for the safer option of intensive training, which does offer the ability to scale up my units faster, which is actually an interesting idea, because that means that things like Arclights, in my case, can provide an extraordinary amount of value by being high level and essentially not exactly one-shotting the steel balls, but getting very close to it. Now I do pick up some Phoenixes. Phoenixes are there just as a limited amount of air support, especially this round, knowing that my opponent will probably go to Mustangs, but I do need something that deals a lot of single target damage to clear off these steel balls. Unfortunately, I did not use the intensive training this round, as I didn't really know what kind of unit or what kind of target I would best be used for. But now that I have confirmed that my opponent is in fact going with the aggressive meta strategy of steel balls and mustangs, I can now safely invest into more Stormcrawlers as well as some Phoenixes and Arclights. Now, a thing to note for anyone else who's fighting against this, or whoever wants to actually try this themselves, the main focus point is that your steel balls, if they connect with a shield or with a large health unit with drain, they become nigh immortal. Similarly to how melting points can't really be killed once they connect with a large target with the same upgrade. However, the best way to counter both the steel balls as well as the mustangs is actually overloaded Stormcallers. The sheer amount of missiles, area of effect damage, and just coverage is entirely too much for the opponent to handle. And the lack of range is actually not that relevant when your opponent is trying to get in your face. That being said, even with things like anti-missile turrets, if your Stormcallers are hitting more or less only targets that are on your side of the battlefield, the effect from the anti-missile turrets is incredibly limited. In fact, it's so limited that it's unlikely to actually do much against the strategy. But my opponent is actually going to be a little bit smart about it. I won't spoil it just yet, but it definitely starts making me sweat a little bit. Generally, I always assume that Stormcallers are a very good counter to this, but as it turns out, it's both. There are two problems here. The crawlers that are actually flanking us here and there, actually distracting the Stormcallers and providing a lot of damage onto our Stormcallers, basically negating much of what they're supposed to be doing for us. But there's also the additional problem that my opponent's strategy does scale very well. Anytime one of my towers fall, that's a lot of XP that I give my opponent, and it's definitely not something that I wanna let my opponent have too much of a privilege of. Now I do want to upgrade my Stormcallers to level 2, as the extra damage is going to matter a lot. However, obviously we are still slightly lacking in resources to fully upgrade our front line. I do put down the shields just to give ourselves extra time to handle both steel balls as well as the Mustangs. But I begin to believe that unless you see a set of skills that are very dangerous, like I saw, which was Acidic Blast and Firebomb, it's actually not necessary to put down the shields, as they're not gonna actually do very much, especially once your opponent starts upgrading their sea ball to have leech. Now, you immediately see where the problem is. Our opponent went with Mustangs that have anti-missile. Now, this is not an upgrade that is omnipotent. It has an issue. Anti-missile Mustangs have two flaws. One, when they're shooting down the missiles, they're not shooting any of the actual real targets. And two, they do become less accurate the more they try to shoot down the missiles. That fact by itself allows us to eventually clean up what our opponent has put down, including that shield. But we are actually on a bit of a timer. We can't entirely kill these steel balls efficiently, as the combination of our opponent's crawlers and steel balls is actually unironically a difficult front line to deal with. My idea was that I could invest into arc lights with extra damage to clear off both the crawlers and the steel balls all in one. But once steel balls reach a set amount of health and levels with the upgrades, arc lights are just not good enough at dealing with them, especially considering that arc lights did get slightly nerfed recently, having their range ever so slightly reduced. It's not a big deal, but it does definitely matter a little bit once you consider that any amount of range between you and something that is essentially melee and leeching definitely helps in your survivability and ability to win the rounds. One thing I could definitely do is build even more Stormcallers in this situation, but I'm kind of short on the resources to allow that, as I'm picking up skills here and there to help myself out. For instance, Smoke Bomb. Reducing the range of the Mustangs actually helps out a lot with dealing not just with the Mustangs but the steel balls, essentially preventing most of the Mustangs from actively shooting down your missiles, while also forcing them to get a lot closer than necessary. And all it really takes is just a few stray missiles to eventually hit the Mustang cluster, and it does eventually get the work done. But you see right there, I've established a shield, and it gets immediately destroyed by the steel balls, as they are very good at handling shields and also leeching life from it. Arclights are also somewhat vulnerable to Mustangs, especially in large numbers, although Arclights do deal with Mustangs to a relevant extent. Now, I'm surprised that my opponent has not invested anything into air, but then again, they are currently trying their best to not just deal with my board, but also move forward with their own game plan, which again allows them to specifically be as aggressive as possible. In this round, I invest into a handful of extra Stormcallers with electromagnetic disruption to essentially stop my opponent's steel balls from leeching. But with the anti-missile stuff happening with the Mustangs, it's a lot less reliable. I do pick up an amplifying core and put it on my Arclight with the hopes that it can eventually two-shot the opposing steel balls, which actually I think does happen. With the extra levels, the upgrade, and the amplifying core, it can in fact get rid of all of these pesky little steel balls and eventually start hitting away at these Mustangs. Now, as much as I would have loved to go into things like Overlords here and check them out after all the buffs, I'm just a little bit too pressured to change my game plan. Any mistake from my part is going to start costing me a lot, both in terms of resources, but also in terms of raw ability to handle my opponent's mess. Now, something you might have noticed here, my opponent actually invested into mechanical range on the crawlers, making them a lot faster, essentially overwhelming my Arclights a lot quicker, and essentially enabling the rest of the army to connect and clear out both the towers as well as my fortifications. This was a very smart option by my opponent. We don't have access to things like a Vulcan that clears out crawlers regardless of how many there are. So, utilizing the fact that we are not going wide, but we're going tall with some single target Arclights, is definitely something you can do. Here I invest into something that I find potentially helpful. Fortresses on level 1 can one-shot level 1 steel balls, but the upgrade kind of messes with the math. However, I do want these fortresses to stay there, not only for the potential damage they provide, but the potential things that they keep summoning. I need a way to distract the steel balls and make them attack units, or specifically chaff, that do not allow them to absorb too much health. But throughout this game, I continuously invest into shields when possible, at least in a few rounds, and I feel like that is a big mistake from my part. If you ever encounter this strategy in the future, please avoid building shields, as the shields unironically feed these steel balls and allow them to essentially not only overwhelm the shield and make it pointless, but also leech off a bunch of health from it. And As you can see, my opponent overwhelmed me here quite quickly. I did invest into a few wasps, hoping that they would attack the tower at least to alleviate some of the pressure, but unfortunately the wasps have served very little purpose, and I'm relatively sad that I did invest into them. By the time they spawned in and actually attacked the tower, basically the fight was over. But here I definitely see something that I like a lot, an incendiary bomb. And I did pick up skill specialist earlier in this game, allowing my skills to come up just in time to cheese my opponent out. Even though my opponent has ridiculous, and I do mean ridiculous, anti-missile tech, the fact that my opponent is still exceptionally vulnerable to fire because the Mustangs are not high level, oddly enough. It's the steel balls that have acquired most of the XP. I just need to get rid of the Mustangs, which gets rid of all the clear that my opponent has, and opens up the way for my Stormcallers to actually deal with the issue. I also noticed that we do get consistently overwhelmed by crawlers on each side of our army, so I put down a few extra level 2 arc lights, hoping that provides enough pressure and clear to deal with these annoying crawlers. And I also do something very unusual for myself. I put the oil on my side of the battlefield that is not connected with the fire, because I just want that oil to be there to slow down some of these steel balls before they connect with the command tower. And if they do connect with the command tower, I want these to be slowed as they leave the area so that my other center can do the same. And as you see, my opponent did in fact go for extra range on the Mustangs, trying to keep them safe, try to make them more reliable as a source of anti-missile tech, but it ended up actually not working very well, as my opponent was still incredibly vulnerable to fire. And this is basically where the game ends. We overwhelm our opponent, our giants are gonna essentially kill our opponent, and more than anything, we just squeeze out a victory. This was ArcSam. Good luck out there, commanders, and have fun.